The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Policy and Practices webinar. Our November webinar today is on universal credit, how are frontline advisors responding? And we're delighted we've got such a great webinar lined up for you today. We're very excited about it. So it's great to have so many of you on the session. Thank you very much for joining. A little bit of housekeeping very briefly before we start, as we normally do. I'd like to do an audio check, please, just to quickly check that everybody can hear me. So in the panel on your right-hand side, you should find a little icon to wave your digital hand. So please put your hand up and let me know. That tells me that you can hear me okay. And while you're doing that, in that same panel, you'll see that there is a facility for you to ask questions. Please do so throughout the webinar of our speakers, and there'll be time at the end where we will come back to those questions and answer them. We'll have a couple of polls during the session because we really do want your input as well. And there's a survey at the end of the webinar which is served immediately. So do please complete that for us. We will have you on your way by 11:30. Excellent. Thank you very much for raising your hands. That's fantastic. I can see that so many are here. It's brilliant to see you. So if you're new and you've not met Policy and Practice before, basically we exist to make the welfare system simple to understand and navigate so that people can make the decisions that work for them. And we help people towards financial independence, and we're a policy-led software and analytics business, and we make the welfare system simple to understand and navigate. We've got 3 services that we use to do that: our data analytics services, our data modelling services, which is our CTR work, and our software, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. Let me move on to the next slide. Our speakers, we've got some fantastic speakers. My colleagues Zoe Charlesworth and Peter Carter. Zoe, do you want to say hello?
Hi.
Thank you. And Peter, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, good morning, everybody.
Thank you. And our guest speaker today is Darren Thomas from Grwp Cynefin. Darren, would you like to say hello?
Hi, good morning, Boida.
Lovely, thank you so much. Brilliant. Okay, so what we're going to be talking through today, the agenda, very simply, we're looking at the big picture, understanding universal credit rollout, and Zoe's going to talk a lot about some of the changes, the very recent changes, and some of our analytical work that we've done, some of our policy work that we've done on universal credit. We're going to look at the current challenges facing landlords and tenants. We're delighted that Darren is here to join us and speak about that. It's brilliant to have a Welsh speaker as well. We're looking at how some housing associations, so Darren is going to talk about how we're going to Grwp Cynefin are meeting those challenges. And then Peter's going to talk a little bit more in depth, picking up on the points that Darren talked about technology that can help. Okay, so before we do that before we get right into that, I'd just like to have our very first poll, if I may. We would like to know, from your point of view, has universal credit full service rolled out in your area yet? This is our first of 2 polls. So if you just bear with me while I get that poll served for you. Okay, so I will launch that poll now, and hopefully you should see that on your screen. Okay, so the question is, has universal credit full service rolled out in your area yet? And the choices, you can choose one choice. Yes, rolled out in all areas. Yes, rolled out in some areas. No, not in any areas yet. Or indeed, I don't know. Brilliant, thank you very much. As I'm talking, I can see lots of people voting, so I'll just give a little bit more time on that. Thank you very much, everybody. I think most people have voted now. So I'm going to close that poll. That's fantastic. And I'm going to share that. And hopefully you should see that on your screen. Excellent. Okay. Zoe, any thoughts on those poll results?
I think it's more or less what we would expect. Most areas now have got full service. the challenge obviously for these areas is going to be around managed migration. It's a growing understanding of UC, the understanding of how they can support people over to UC, but managed migration is still down the road going to hit all these areas quite hard, all depending on how it is rolled out. So yeah, more or less as I would have expected, Janet.
Excellent, lovely. Well, that's always good to know. Surprises sometimes are not are not always welcome. So let me no further ado. Let me roll on to our next part of the slide. And Zoe, it's over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to cover, it's quite timely this webinar actually for us, because we've just published some research that's looked at how the work allowance changes under the budget have affected people on universal credit. And I know that everybody on the front line, there are various issues you're all dealing with for the process of claim, supporting people as they move over to universal credit. But actually, for people who are seeing huge drops in the income as they go over to universal credit, this is a barrier to claim itself. And we do know from our qualitative work, it puts a lot of people off claiming. So the investment of 2.7 billion has been really welcome. This got our analysis of where this is going, got some coverage in the Times, and you might have seen some of the headline figures there. Our analysis showed that this affected 2.6 million households, which is slightly higher than the government's analysis. And we found that 2.3 million of these with children, but only 0.3 million were households with limited capability of work. And we would expect that, and we'll come on to that later. Overall, employed households gain because it's a work allowance. But surprisingly, people who are self-employed, disabled, ill, there was very little change pre-budget and post-budget. And we'll come on to why that is shortly. And obviously those out of work, this budget didn't really assist at all because it was all based around work allowances. It was very narrowly targeted. I'll move on to the next slide, please, Janet. So let's have a look at the main things brought in through the budget. The work allowances were increased, but they weren't extended back to where they were. They were only increased for those people who currently had work allowances. The self-employed, there's going to be a transitional protection for everybody as they move over to universal credit. And this is a really good idea. I mean, this is very, very welcome. It'll give people a chance, if they want to move into employment, out of self-employment, a time to think about how the minimum income floor is going to affect them. Talking to housing associations, I know this is a real breathing space for you, that you can actually contact these people in that year they move over, show them what the minimum income floor will have, how it will have an impact on them. They have then got time to decide what they do. The deductions from UC is going to go down from 40% to 30%, very welcome by everybody. Unfortunately, as with most of these announcements, it's not happening immediately, October 2019. The migration, the assistance of an extra 2 weeks payment of the DWP benefits being introduced in 2020 will really help people who are still to migrate then. I mean, the issue we've got is that we actually calculated that this is not going to affect that many people on certainly JSA. On IS, probably about 50%. ESA, there'll be more still on managed migration at 2020. And the people who have migrated before that won't benefit from this at all. And obviously, once you get to managed migration, the biggest groups you're migrating over are people on tax credits, and they don't get this additional support. Perhaps that's well targeted because they, of course, are more used to having the monthly payments. The delay in the surplus earnings reduction is expected, really. I mean, there hasn't been a lot come back from the test and learn phase of that, so we're expecting that to stay at the high level and only go down to the 300 in 2020. So the recovery of advances is going to be extended, and that's not till 2021, slower rollout. But what's had a big impact is will have a big impact from April is the increase in the minimum wage. And that's really had quite a big impact on the situation that people who will be migrating over to universal credit will face. And then we'll just come on to those impacts in a second. Yeah, can we move on, Janet? Yep. Thanks. So after pre and post budget, We noticed that households that lose support as they go from legacy benefits to universal credit drops by about 200,000, and households gaining also goes up by 200,000. That doesn't mean that's not the number who are affected by the work allowances. It's the difference between legacy benefits and universal credit. So from April 2019, instead of 3 million people losing support, 2.8 million are losing support. So that's the overall impact. We'll go into more detail on the next slide. Something that we found extremely interesting was, probably need to explain this one slightly. Before the budget, the average change from people moving to universal credit to legacy benefit was a loss of about £18. That's £18 a week. After the budget, this went down to £12. So the average gain from the budget across all people on benefits was about just under £6. But we still end up with an average loss as people move from legacy benefits to universal credit. And what's interesting about that £6 is about 2/3 of it is to do with work allowance, and about a third is to do with the increase in the minimum wage and the tax thresholds. Another interesting finding that this table illustrates is that an awful lot of the support went to those who are already better off under universal credit. So for those who are gaining support as they move from legacy benefits, there was a huge jump in the amount they were gaining. They were gaining £25 a week on average before the budget, but £44 a week after the budget. So those who are gaining as they move from legacy benefits to universal credits, this budget really supported. They are now gaining an extra £18. But for those that were losing before the budget, and they were losing on average of £57, we actually see an even higher loss. And that might be surprising once you consider the 1.7 billion that's gone into work allowances. Why should anybody lose? But we'll explain that probably under the next slide. So we have a look at the particular, well, actually, let's first of all just go through the government announcement that they were restoring work allowances. I think this is a question that we've been asked by the Social Security Advisory Committee and by others. So obviously there's no restoration of work allowances for those without children or ESA. So the original design of universal credit had work allowances for everybody. For tenants, the work allowances are now restored and they're higher than the pre-2016 levels. So tenants have really gained from this, but for homeowners, they are significantly below the April 2016 levels, which is why people on tax credits will often see such a huge drop when they move over to universal credit. So a lone parent homeowner would see a drop of $242 a month compared to the 2016 levels. So no, they haven't been restored. They have been very targeted at certain groups of people, and those people are seeing quite a big gain. I'll go to the next slide if that's okay, Janet. So who are the gainers? Working households, obviously, but people in employment are the big winners, gaining an average of £18.41 a week from the budget. That means they are now £9 a week better off compared to legacy benefits. So for most people in employment, they will gain as they move over to universal credit. The reason we had a slight drop in the amount that people lost for those who did lose support is the impact on self-employed households. Now, although they will also get the work allowance if they've got ESA or children, the minimum income floor is based on the minimum wage. So you put the minimum wage up, the minimum income floor goes up higher, so higher income is being taken into account. So that increase offsets any gain from the work allowances, and they end up actually just slightly worse off. So before the budget, we saw them at about £50 worse off a week as they move over from legacy benefits, and this stays much the same post-budget. For disabled and ill households, there's very little change, and they'll still be on average £28 a week worse off. There was a lot in the papers about the budget aiming at disabled people. In fact, if you think about it, if people are on PIP and they don't get ESA, if they don't have children, they have no work allowance anyway, so it doesn't really affect them. And people on ESA, it will only affect those whose, if they do work and they are well enough to work, their earnings are above the current work allowances and below the threshold by which they come off ESA. So that's a tiny little narrow band of people who are actually supported by this. So although there's been a lot of publicity about how it was aimed at disabled and ill households, in fact, it's made very, very little difference. We found that 3% of households on ESA was helped by the budget and 16% of people on PIP. And the people on PIP will be people who are not on ESA working with children. Overall, though, it was good news for households with children who will be £10.56 a week better off. But overall, they still will receive less under universal credit than under legacy benefits. And I think one of the claims of the budget was it would bring 200,000 children out of poverty. We found something very similar. We have a very different resilience measure in policy and practice because we like to take into account the cost of rent because it's and housing costs because of the regional variations. And we found that households that were in crisis to pre-budget to post-budget, we noticed that there are about 50,000 children in households that were in crisis before the budget who weren't in crisis after the budget. So that's got to be good news. So everyone's got to be pleased that there's money going into the budget. It is money going into universal credit. It has been very narrowly targeted. And there are groups that I think that we would have liked to see get more support, people with disabilities who don't get ESA, who lose out very heavily under universal credit. The self-employed, I know that there's a transitional arrangements now, but that in general, only about 10% of people are in their first year of self-employment. So, and we are noticing as people move over to universal credit, a big drop in self-employment. A lot of people are giving up their self-employment, but it's generally, if you look at the figures for self-employment, it's people chose to do it because of caring responsibilities that weren't enough to stop conditionality, or there were other health reasons that they chose self-employment or travel reasons. So it's a real shame that it's pushing people who were trying to do some work into not working. At PIP, we're now trying to focus on what can be done within the whole system, because for people on the ground, and if you do any sort of discussion with people who are actually receiving universal credit, the thing they bring up more than the level of the money they receive is the whole process. Of course, you've got the change to monthly, you've got that big wait at the beginning, but there's also real problems around the standard of delivery at the moment. And we're suggesting, we've just asked, the Social Security Advisory Committee asked for our comments post-budget on what still required being mended within the system. And these are some of the areas we focused on. We think that the DWP really needs to set itself some performance standards. This was brought up by the National Audit Office as well, that we aren't measuring in any way how successful universal credit is or how quickly claims are being processed. And this should at least match existing standards for the length of time it takes to process claims, call waiting times. And we also think there should be more training for specialist staff, more training for DWP staff. We're getting an awful lot of reports of there just isn't the knowledge at the call centre. So when people are phoning up for assistance, they're not getting the sort of help they should get. A lot of it's falling back on frontline organisations, local authorities, CABs, housing associations to do the work that should be undertaken by the DWP. One of the main areas that came up to us over and over again was this working, that the DWP should be working better with landlords, and in particular they should be seeing some landlords, social landlords specifically, as assistance to helping people move over to universal credit. At the moment, they seem to be a bit reticent to work hand in hand with housing associations that actually it's a win-win situation if that partnership could be extended. And the third thing we're calling for is a flexibility to approach. People should have a choice about how often they're paid. They should have a choice about if they go online or they have a paper application process. There should be help with verification and bank accounts. And all these are just within the administration, but they really have an impact on people moving over to universal credit. But more than that, they sort of create a fear of universal credit. So even some of those households that we saw would be better off. If you've got problems within the whole process of application and management of a claim, you've got people who would be better off, who just don't want to move over. And I think this comes to, a lot of this is being mitigated by the work of frontline organisations, and it's falling on their shoulders. The work being done by local authorities and housing associations and other frontline organisations is absolutely remarkable in the way they are helping people through this process. And I'm very interested to hear from Darren what's happening with their housing association.
Great, Zoe. Thank you very much. Before we move over to Darren, I've got the second poll of the webinar, if I may. That was very interesting, Zoe. Thank you ever so much. The poll we've got now is: what is the single biggest issue you face with universal credit rollout? I'm making you choose one. And indeed, please do feel free to click other if we haven't listed the issue that is most important to you. Great, thank you. I can see some of the votes being cast as we speak. So yes, so what is the single biggest issue you face with universal credit rollout? The options are managing delays to payments, securing alternative payment arrangements, gaining explicit consent from tenants, getting tenants to pay, or other. Is there another issue that we haven't covered here? Brilliant, thank you very much. I can see that the votes are coming in, and as I say, if we haven't covered the one issue that is important to you, please do say other. And also, actually, if you could jot in the chat box or even as a question, just let us know what your one issue is. There's quite a sizable chunk of people who are saying it's an other issue, so do please let us know in the chat functionality what that issue is. Brilliant. Most people have voted now, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you, which hopefully you should see on screen. So, very interesting results. I shall read them out. 44% say the biggest issue is managing delays to payments. In second place, joint second place, 22% the issue is getting tenants to pay or other. We're very interested to know what the other ones are. 10% the issue is gaining explicit consent from tenants, and 2% securing APAs. Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, anybody want to comment on those results? Or will I head straight to Darren?
Well, Janet, I would like to say that we did something very similar poll about a year ago, and the alternative payment arrangements was a really big one. We know that the DWP's put an awful lot of work into the landlord portal, into making APAs much easier, much simpler, and I think that really shows that's had an effect. I think the delays to payment is exactly what I was talking about on the previous slide, that actually we need a presumed quality of processing, a presumed quality of assessment time, because the 5 weeks is long anyway. That's long. That's causing problems with technical arrears for housing associations, causing severe problems for households. Once you look at a third of those is beyond that time, this starts becoming a really serious issue. So I'm not surprised that was the one selected by most people.
Two of the comments there, a couple of the comments that have come very quickly, some of the comments that are coming in, thank you everybody for putting your comments in. One of the comments talks about accuracy of assessments, leaving residents with very little income to pay rent. Another one is getting APAs paid at the same time as claimant is the major issue and cuts across two of your issues. In particular,
yeah, I think that's the one I know that the DWP is going to be investing in a payment system, so hopefully within a couple of years, I mean, I don't know how long that'll take. They're only just looking at tendering for that now. So hopefully the payment systems at some point will be in sync. I think that's going to be quite a couple of years down the line, but I don't know how housing associations cope with that. It must be very, very difficult.
It seems to be, another person talks about untidy tenancies, another person talks about the 13th missing payment, and so on. I think
it's all the stuff we heard in our northern. We had ran a Northern Voices event where we heard from people on the front line and tried to gather all their thoughts to feed back to the DWP. And actually, we also did the same in London. And the untidy tenancies is being brought up and over again. And the DWP have said they're looking into that. So I think we're going to see more regulations around that.
Brilliant, thank you, Zoe. Just one of the person talks about the advocacy, being able to talk on the claimant's behalf. There's loads of issues there, so that's really useful feedback. I'm very mindful of time, and I know that Darren is chomping at the bit, so I'll close this poll now, we'll move on to yourself, Darren. So let me get your slides. Over to you, Darren Thomas, Grwp Cynefin. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Janet, and thanks for having me. And thanks very much, Zoe, for that really interesting presentation. It tied in with lots of the issues that we're coming across as a housing association at the moment, and hopefully we'll pick up on a couple of them as we go through the presentation. It's a bit slide heavy, but I assume these slides will be available to everybody after we finish. And if you have any questions, we're more than happy to answer them. So I think we can move on to the next slide, please, Janet. So briefly, we're going to cover who we are, Grwp Cynefin, so that you understand the context and the geographical context of where we operate, why we chose policy and practice, roughly how we use policy and practice on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully we'll be able to extol the virtues of the benefits of using policy and practice and how we and our tenants benefit from using this software. So in the next slide, you can see that we're Grwp Cynefin and we provide more than 3,800 homes for rent on social rent, as well as 700 affordable properties. They don't all look like the little mock-up I've made, but you get the idea. So following that, our operating area covers 7 local authorities in North and Mid Wales, from the Llyn Peninsula in the west over to just by Chester, Saltney area, Wrexham, and then again from the top of the Isle of Anglesey all the way down to Mid Powys, which is at the bottom of the slide. And then in the next slide, we'll see we've a group structure, which covers, and I do apologise, some of these slides are in Welsh as well, because I've nicked them from another presentation. But don't worry, I won't be going off into Welsh at any stage during the presentation. So we have Canllaw, which manages our Gwynedd and Anglesey, or Ynys Môn Care and Repair Agency. We've also Conwy and Denbighshire Care and Repair. And we have Gorwel, which is our service that provides support for families suffering domestic abuse, as well as services for older and young people. And then in the next slide, you'll see we have 4 offices across North Wales, which kind of gives you an idea of the geographic spread that we have. And we'll kind of come on to that a bit more in our next slide, I hope. So we have generic housing officers. The whole idea is as part of the meeting the challenges of welfare reform, really, that we know our tenants rather, and that came out of some of the learning that was done from other housing associations across the UK in the demonstration projects, the pilots for universal credit, quite a few years ago now. We do a lot of profiling work of our tenants, our customers. We use Housing Hub's Insight, the Experian Insight, credit checking, customer data software, and of course, policy and practice. The whole idea is that we can get to know our tenants, get to know their needs, and then signpost or refer them effectively onto our in-house welfare team, tenancy support, our energy wardens, or more and more importantly, our partners that offer independent debt advice. So we have, as we said, an in-house welfare team, and this is quite an old slide, apologies, but just gives you an idea of the caseload that we're dealing with as we move on to universal credit. It's quite a varied caseload really that our officers have, and the point of this slide is that the policy and practice actually facilitates a great deal of this casework. And so we can move on to the next slide, which it picks up on Zoe's point actually. Our customer insight software lets us know where our tenants will be, as well as our staff, and how they're struggling. Our biggest problem is tenants are very apprehensive about transitioning onto universal credit, particularly groups that we wouldn't normally associate with that. So they'd be the ones that are in work, as well as ones that are on tax credits. And so organisationally, we're having to provide a united front that universal credit is the only game in town, so to speak. And on the next slide, we'll see that we have 2,482 tenants of working age that we've identified, with 931 of these tenants in receipt of housing benefit. And they are really the ones that we would consider to be the ones on low income, especially the ones on full housing benefit. And they are the ones that we traditionally think of that would need front-loaded support, and also support during the transition onto universal credit. I think it's worth saying at this point, sorry I haven't got a slide on this, that we are universal credit full service in 5 of the 7 counties we operate, with Anglesey and Gwynedd transitioning on the 5th and 12th of December respectively. So on the next slide we'll see a high-level view of the segmenting work that we're doing with tenants using Insight, which lets us identify which tenants are under financial strain and therefore will need more help with the transition over to universal credit and any changes to their benefit entitlements, as well as the ones that we would consider to be just a little bit more resilient, that would have some financial resilience inbuilt into the household. Moving on to how we use policy in practice. As you've seen, we operate across a large geographical area, and it is very large, travelling from the west of our operating area where I live over to our office in the east. It's quite a journey. Our biggest concern was, as universal credit rolls out in a westward direction, that we have consistency and that our tenants get the same service, and also that the knowledge our advisors, as in frontline advisors, from welfare advisors, housing officers, energy wardens, tenancy support workers, etc., that they have something to fall back on. Policy and practice gives us that because we can basically access it from anywhere. On the next slide, we'll just kind of see some of the operational stuff that we're doing with our tenants. So we've inbuilt policy and practice into our tenancy sign-up procedure, where every tenant undergoes, with their permission, the Experian Insight credit check, just to give them an overview of their financial resilience of the household, which might alert us to any support needs, such as if a large amount of non-priority debts, etc., or the financial strain in the household. That lets us then discuss affordability, which we all know is a key part. Policy and practice is the way that it deals with benefit entitlement, as well as the income expenditure of the household, is something that gives our advisors the confidence to have these frank discussions with households. We're finding we're picking up potential issues, and we'll see this on the next slide, a lot further upstream. So if we could just transition on to the next slide, great, thank you. We've got what we'd call our risk indicator on the bottom right there, which, coupled with an income expenditure profile that shows higher costs than income, actually lets us have the ongoing conversation with tenants as to how they're going to manage their tenancy. So of course the next bit of that really is benefit entitlement as well. So on the next slide we'll have another little screenshot there that our tenants are, it's okay for us to say that our tenants are very apprehensive about the change to universal credit, and it's okay for advisors to go out and say everything will be fine, this is the only game in town. We find that nothing speaks better to our tenants than facts and figures. So for instance, if a tenant's undergoing natural migration for universal credit, they're infrequently told by DWP how much they will receive, or if they are told, it's hard for them to contextualise what they're going to receive and the breakdown of universal credit. So what we're able to do is we're able to give a timeline of the first payment from the information on the journal, and we're also able to break down the benefit entitlement that our tenants are going to receive for the long wait, which can be for up to 5 weeks, of course. We know that we've spoken a bit about work allowances, and with all due respect to frontline advisors, work allowances changing, they won't really have the knowledge to be able to make an informed decision on that using things such as policy and practice. They're quite good at incorporating the changes so that whatever information is put in will come out with a realistic scenario, which when we're trying to move our tenants into work, we'll see in the next slide, we're able to use the better off in work scenarios, which actually lets our tenants know where we are. So we've gone ahead a little bit quickly there, haven't we? So I'll just see this one up here. Thank you, Janet. We're able to see where we are. We're able to signpost tenants then effectively onto any support for looking for work, and it's a very seasonal labour market, especially in the west of Wales. So having the confidence to tell our tenants that they will be better off in work is something that's vital for our frontline staff. So yeah, and we can finally move on to the next one. We're also obviously using policy and practice of tenants in the end areas, and as every housing association knows, the transition from direct payments and the housing benefit onto one monthly payment can cause quite a bit of problems for our tenants. So having used policy and practice in that sign up or at different stages, our tenants realise that we have one consistent and coherent way of dealing with any issues around expenditure, rent arrears and financial resilience really. The model that we tend to use is that frontline housing officers will go out and have an initial conversation. If there's anything that needs to be addressed, it might be benefit entitlement, it might be ability to gain access to work, there might be some barriers there, it might be fuel poverty, a wide range of different issues. The way that we can save our cases in policy and practice and then the other officer can come along and pick it up means that we're actually building on this transition. And I can remember the days when we used to use paper-based income expenditure exercises, and there'd be 10 attached to one tenant, because we all know that income expenditure profiles change over time completely. And so what we, sorry, somebody just walked in on me there. So what we can do is we can identify the unrealistic expenditure profiles, and when it's passed on to our welfare team, we're able to build on that conversation and not have to start again. This saves us quite a bit of time, especially when we do a lot of advice over the phone. And through email and through Skype as well, so that we can communicate and we can download and email the results of any work that we've done with tenants. And on the next slide, we have the action plan as well. So the ability to just record a discussion and send it to the tenant means that we have a record of advice, I guess, and so that when that tenant moves on to another officer, might move on to our housing officers after working with the welfare team, we know that conversation has happened. The action plan that we use quite extensively, we use action plans because they're time bound and they're coherent and they give us a common ground and a common aim, if you like, so it keeps the advice in a smart sort of context as well. The action plans tenants will come back to us and tell us they've completed the action plans, and then we can move on. So it's part of the ongoing financial capability work that we do with our tenants. So the next slide, I'm glad to hear, is coming to the end, but the benefits of using policy in practice for us, our tenants need to understand how much money they will receive and when they're going to receive it. We're finding that tenants that understand that in 4 weeks' time, 5 weeks' time, they will receive X amount, which will be attributed to their rent, it will be attributed to their personal allowance, it will be attributed to their child and childcare elements, etc., or any disability element, that they're more likely to engage with the benefit system, with universal credit. We do get quite a few tenants that come back to us and say, I'm in rent arrears because of the transition to universal credit, which may be in part true, but because of the bad press that universal credit is receiving nationwide at the moment, it's easy just to blame universal credit as a systematic failure of the benefit system. And we all know that it's not true. We all know that we have problems. But what policy in practice lets us do really is it gives our advisors the confidence to draw the line under the fallacy and to actually sort of get to grips with what the core issues in the household are around benefit entitlement, income expenditure, and ability to work. So the introduction of universal credit full service, we're finding that we're using the policy in practice resource. There's a greater use of it in our counties that are universal credit full service, and there's a greater use of the action planning, etc., than the 2 counties that are currently on legacy benefits. So thank you very much, Janet. And thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you very much, Darren. That was excellent. And everybody, if I can prompt you again, I'm sure you do have plenty of questions for Darren about the experiences of Grwp Cynefin. So do please pop them into the panel and we will get to them very shortly. And without further ado, I am now going to attempt to share and introduce my colleague, Peter Carter, who is going to take us through the next part of the webinar. So let me just quickly change presenter.
That's great. That was very interesting, Darren. Thanks very much indeed for your input there. I'm just curious, while things are coming over to me to show you the software in more detail, just how many of you were trying to say out loud the Welsh bit on the Darren screens there? I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when everybody's trying to say diolch and trying to say things without spraying everybody in your orifices. Because I know I can't say Llanfair Pwllgwynedd Golgaric Pindrobus Llansilio Gogogog, which is where I nearly had a meeting the other day. But there we go. That's the Welsh for you. Thanks, Darren. Okay, let's. Can everybody see my screen, Janet? Everybody can see that? Okay, fine.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm just going to go through the calculator to highlight some of the features that Darren was talking about, and some of the ways in which the calculator as a policy engine can help you understand how everything works in the welfare reforms. And I think really people are using the software from 2 perspectives. One is to help advisors understand how the benefit system is working and to help so they can explain that to residents. And the other one, of course, is to help residents move to financial independence. From my perspective, what I hear around the country is, of course, the welfare reforms are around trying to move people into work. We can see that from what Zoe was saying earlier on. But really, it's around trying to help people move into different financial resilience and financial independence. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we want to gather some information. So I've created a case here called webinar. This will be the, for those of you who still watch Blue Peter, the one I prepared earlier. So we can see various things going on. I'm just going to say a little bit about the household. I'm based on the Wirral, so actually you could see where I am on Darren's maps, the Wirral Peninsula. And if I stand on the roof, I can see Denbigh from where I live here. So this is a Wirral postcode. The reason why I'm using a Wirral postcode is because it's a live area for universal credit, so I can show both systems. So I've got a person who's single. There's 2 children in the household, and there's one adult as a non-dependent in the household. And their circumstances for being a non-dependent is just they're under 21. The person who I picked on has got a slight disability, is being assessed, so they're being assessed yet to apply or unsure about what their circumstances are. So there's one or two things going on here. If we move on to property details, I say your local council is Wirral, living in the Universal Credit area, 3-bedroom property, £110 per week, and so we can see a little bit about it. We also are picking up on council tax, not exempt from council tax, and so all of that goes in at £128 per month being paid in. I've given this particular individual a little bit of work, not too much, because they you know, if they're applying, so it's only £8.50 an hour at 14 hours, a little bit of work. And one of the reasons for doing this, and we can also pick up a whole range of other things. Somebody was asking me about pension contributions. If you do have other areas of income, all of this is available, so you can start saying actually what is the source of your income, and all this can be made available to you. So anything that you want to pick up on is possible with the calculator, and it's very straightforward and easy to go through. Anytime you see a question mark, you can just highlight some advice around how to complete things and to fill it in. So it becomes very straightforward in terms of completing a calculation. Now we've got everything in there, we can go straight to the results page. And when we go to the results page, we can start seeing exactly how this person's income is calculated. On the right-hand side here, you'll see the current situation, which amends. And as Darren was showing, we can also see that I've put some figures already into the budgeting part of the calculator. We can see this person is losing, it has a shortfall of £76.19 per month at the moment. But I want to help this individual understand how their systems, how their calculation and how their benefits have been made up. So if I can click on the little information sign here, you can see the housing benefit has been made up in terms of the rent entered, reduction due to non-dependence in the property, and I can want to have a look at that in more detail. And this is all available to share with your residents, with your clients, with the person who's come in to talk to you, and you can start seeing exactly how the importance that Darren was talking about is saying it's very, people understand and want to understand how the benefits are made up. They want to understand what will happen and why things are calculated. It also helps people to understand what benefits they're eligible to receive. So all of that can go in there, and we can look at all kinds of different aspects of this. The first thing that I want to talk about is to say, would I be better off under universal credit? So if I just do a quick comparison straight away, we can see that actually, under the circumstances I put in, which have been fairly deliberate, you'll be worse off by £196.11 per month under universal credit. And if I wanted to, I could go and have a look at a detailed breakdown of universal credit to see exactly how that's been made up. And one of the mysteries, I think, of life at the moment is, how is universal credit calculated? Well, in the same way that I showed how housing benefits are calculated, I can highlight how it's been calculated here. So we can just click on here and we can start seeing the breakdown of universal credit. So we can start seeing the housing element, the adult element, the child element, and so on. So we ultimately get to the award in terms of what's there. And again, we can go to an expert calculation breakdown of that in more detail. So understanding where your benefits are coming from is one aspect of what we're trying to show here, so people understand what their benefits are. And in this circumstances, you can see that they're worse off under universal credit. So all of that information is there. The first thing, of course, let's just go back to the current system. As Darren said, is would you be better off if you took on more earnings? Well, we can do a very quick look at that here. So we can say, actually, under the current benefit system, if we were to move to more work here, we can say, actually, with this change, you'll be worse off by £176. And that's because of the ESA element that they were receiving. If I was to now click on universal credit and do that, you'll be better off under universal credit by £130. But very quickly, we can see the difference in the way in which work incentives help people in universal credit rather than people on the legacy systems. And again, all of that is available to be broken down. One of the early things we can start doing is saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could just link that to universal jobs match to help people? And we can just link that to universal jobs match. But straight away, we can start looking at sales representatives' jobs in the Wirral area. So there's a very quick look at that. The other area we can start thinking about is to start thinking about universal credit in a little bit more detail. We know that income is paid monthly, and but actually it becomes uneven in terms of the way in which universal credit will be paid. So we actually can provide you with a universal credit calculator, calendar, sorry. And so once I bring down the income details, I can generate the calendar, and we can start helping people to understand where they will be peaks and troughs in their overall income, so they can start budgeting better across it. And you'll see the way in which this is calculating to say these are areas where there's less universal credit coming in because of their income from work, excuse me, is greater. And of course, one of the other things that Darren was talking about is helping people to budget, so we can put in income around and provide advice for households on their budget. So we can start entering the costs. We can do that in a number of different ways. So for utilities, this household, I've said their gas is £120 per month. But if we don't know, and they don't know what they're spending on various things, we can put in the average amount. What would be the average spend on gas per month? Which is where we take this from survey data, and Zoe can go into more details exactly where all this data comes from, would be normally £78.45 per month for a household in these circumstances, based on the Wirral, based from the information we're able to put into the calculator to support what you're doing. And it's not just utilities, but it's information around spending on all kinds of stuff. So we get down to groceries, and that's £90 a month. They have alcohol, and it's less than a packet of cigarettes a day. So the whole information in terms of around how people are spending their money goes into here. And that ultimately says, are we spending our money well or not? And one of the slides, screen captures that Darren showed earlier on, was the ability to have a look at a cost summary around all of this. And it pulls out areas where people are potentially able to save money, where they're spending money greater than some of their would be average for where they are and how they're living. So after costs, you're left with a shortfall of £272, and this is very easy to share with your residents to show actually your gas is £41 more than similar households, alcohol, smoking, debt, and so on. So if I wanted to do a combination of things, and we saw from Darren's slide, he gave a scenario and was talking about scenarios to help people understand what differences they could make if they were to do different things. So I'm going to create a scenario, just show you how easy that is to do. And we can start seeing that actually under scenario, current situation and scenario 1, there's very little difference going on here when we see the results in here, as it just builds the information up. Obviously my Wi-Fi speed is slow, but I'm going to go and do a couple of different things in my scenario. So everything's the same at the moment. I'm first of all going to suggest that we could take on more work. Despite the fact that we could move to 36 hours, let's just move that to 36 hours. But the other main thing we're going to start doing is start looking at budget, and I'm going to go and change expenditure in a number of different ways. Just while I'm talking about this and doing this, the other area that people are using the software for is to look at debt and debt repayments. So a number of enforcement agencies are now using the software to help people understand the difference between the can't pays and the won't pays, to help the vulnerable, to create better repayment for the vulnerable, and to make sure that when people are able to do things, they're able to spend that more evenly. So just making a few changes in terms of move to utilities and move that to the average amount there, and then go back to the results page. And hopefully we'll be able to see that in doing what we've done, income has now gone up, and after costs, we're now able to be a little bit more within our means. So now we've gone from a situation where we were minus £272 a month to a plus of £205 a month. And this is, of course, where we can start creating action plans for individuals. The other thing we wanted to do, and very quickly now, I'm aware of time and I'm rushing through this, as you can plainly tell, and apologies for that, is we offer separate advice and support. And this is customizable. This is customized around every individual case. So if we're looking at the advice and support that your colleagues may want to give to the resident who's come in, we can start thinking about rent shortfall and DHPs, universal credit eligibility, warm home discount for non-pensioners, and so on. And we can provide some text around that so advice for this individual household can be provided. I've raced through that. There's an awful lot in there, but the point about what we're trying to say is this software is helping people to understand what their financial position is, helping them to transition onto universal credit and the impacts of that. But what can they do about making sure that given those changes circumstances, they're able to maintain financial resilience and move into a position where they are not in deficit, but actually have some money available at the end of every month to live on. Janet, I'll hand back to you at that stage. If there's any questions, please let me know. And feel free to grab the screen back from me.
Brilliant, will do. Thank you very much, Peter. And I know, as you say, that was a quick canter through. It doesn't really do justice. I'm sure many of you have sort of want to scream and go back to that slide or whatever. So there is the opportunity to ask for access to the calculator, to have a browse at your own leisure. I'm also aware that a lot of people might join as a group, have it in a meeting, and so you might want to play with it yourself. So there is opportunity to do that. As Peter says, we're kind of nearing the end of the webinar, and we've got lots of questions that have come in. So I'm going to unmute Darren and Zoe, and I'm going to fire a couple of questions at you, if I may. So I think let me just pick one out here. I think this is a question going back to yourself, Darren. For Darren, how many staff are in your welfare team? How frequently do they measure financial resilience?
Okay, so we have 3. We will increase the team size to 4 by the end, well, by next week, actually. We have a new member joining us next week. How do we measure financial resilience? We use, we're in the process of benchmarking how we check our financial resilience, really. We're using the Insight software to measure financial resilience and how many of our tenants are actually in financial distress using the Housing Hub Insight software. What we tend to do then is just use policy and practice, the income expenditure bit that Peter showed you all, just to capture all of that. But the financial resilience, really, it's more measured on are our tenants accessing the benefits that they need, are they at a stage that they need to move to work, etc. So it's a fluid thing. We do a static measure once a month. But actually, when we're getting down to the face-to-face thing, it's more based on our generic housing officers understanding their patch. They have pro rata 250 tenancies, and they deal with everything from the lettings, allocations, income collection, antisocial behaviour, etc. So it's part of their patch. We'd ask every officer really just to measure the financial resilience based on that.
And they have a lot to do in that time, that those housing officers. And you did mention it previously about the ability to save and store cases and go back to them and build up, and therefore be building up the profile of the person that you're working with is very useful for you. Absolutely,
and I think that's partly our take on PBS, personal budgeting support. Really, is that actually there is a provision for personal budgeting support within the tenancy, and the handover of files and the scenarios that Peter outlined earlier helps us build that case. So the financial capability and the financial resilience inbuilt within the household, it's very rarely attributed to one aspect, and we all know that financial inclusion and financial capability, or financial resilience rather, are fluid things. So the ability to hand over the files between officers and having a named officer then in charge of that file when they're running the case is invaluable to us.
Brilliant, thank you. I have a question here for Zoe. Is the benefit and budgeting calculator used for debt advice? And if so, it means it is covered by FCA regs, ?
It's more budgeting at the moment than debt. It is certainly used for people who are working with people with debt. The spread of debt, the offer to repay debts, the amalgamation of debts is a module we're working on at the moment. It's something we have been working with Money Advice Service to sure that everything, all the output from the calculator is SFS compliant. So within that, people are using it for if they need to do any sort of action or they need to produce anything in SFS format. That's entirely possible. Obviously, some of that involves interviews with tenants and stuff that we haven't actually picked, you can't actually pick up within a calculator, and those are left as free text fields. So that aspect's there. We're moving more and more into that as a, to do the proper debt, which is a separate, you know, it's a separate discipline to actually spread debts and to come to debt agreements. But it's certainly something that we've been talking very much about recently, and we've started looking at specifying within the calculator.
Lovely, thanks, Zoe. I'm going to ask this question, and I'm very conscious of time, and I know that people have to scoot off. But I'm going to ask this question of yourself, Darren, and this is coming from one of the attendees. Would you say the benefit and budgeting calculator is similar to others on the market? If not, how different is it, or in what ways is it different? Do you want to kick that one off, Darren?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Just, you know, the very nature of benefit entitlement means that you are quite structured, as well as the facility for scenarios, etc. We've used benefit calculators in the past. It's more to do with the actual user interface and how easy the benefit calculator is to use, because we are, I mean, this is the front end of some very complex calculations that are going on behind this. The majority of our issues we've had is actually with advisors having the confidence, and it's giving advisors the confidence. As Peter said, it's definitely the two ways we use this calculator. Our advisors need the confidence to tell one of our tenants, customers, that this is how much you will be getting. How quickly you can put that in and how easily you can get that information, and how that information is presented in an understanding way, is what kind of swung it for us on policy and practice. Because when we were looking for a benefit calculator, we did trial several others as well. So it's down to the user interface, and how easily we can communicate that information and how easily we can share it with officers and tenants.
Brilliant, thank you. It's great to hear, and we're delighted to have you on board. Zoe, Peter, would there be anything that you would add to Darren on that question?
I think from our point of view, when it was designed, because so many of us come from frontline organisations and have worked with people on the front line, that the point that Darren made there is absolutely vital. I mean, it was completely designed to make things as easy as possible for people to understand, because I take Darren's point that really, if people don't understand what they're going to have coming in, how can they make any choices whatsoever? The information about other ways of maximising your income, I think, is absolutely vital. Not in a generic way, not in a read through this massive great script to find out what you're entitled to type way, but it's much more about this benefit you could get. This, you could do this to help your situation. Under your situation, you can get free childcare. You're entitled to free prescriptions. Have you thought about changing from ESA to IS? It's lots of information to help people navigate some of those regulations around choice of benefits, making sure you've got the right elements, premiums. They're actually really complex for people, and they're even complex for the benefit advisors who've been working in it for decades. So actually to be able to bring those out and to allow people to have it as a very, very personalised experience, I think was something we aimed for right from the beginning.
And just 2 points I would add to that, Zoe, that complexity. One thing that we do whenever any, and indeed, Zoe, you talked at length at the beginning about the policy updates, and whenever policy updates are enacted, then the updates are made at the right time to the calculator. So what you see is always accurate. And then I suppose the other thing that I would bring out as well is the inbuilt help functionality. If you've got a question that you can't answer, you've got Zoe on the other end of a screen to help you, which I imagine.
I'd just like to say that about the work allowances. I mean, an example of that is the new work allowances, although we're not showing those in the calculations yet because they don't come into place until next April. Those little messages that Peter showed that give you information about your claim, they're going to show saying exactly how much better off somebody will be from next April. So although the work allowances aren't taken now, also giving future information, which actually is good for the advisors as well. Because if a situation looks bad now, you could be saying, well, this is let's find a way of you managing till April, and in April you'll be this amount better off. So it's to do with that whole helping people move on, really.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm extremely conscious of time, so I'm going to cut it there, but I know that I do have some questions that the panel hasn't got to, and we will get those answers to you after the webinar. I would just quickly like to point you to, in this panel on the right hand side I keep talking about, that you can download a flyer about the software that the calculator that we've talked about today, but you can also as well download Zoe's autumn budget 2018 policy paper that we gave to the SSAC. You can also request in the follow-up email survey, you can request the updated Universal Credit Roadmap. We know there's a lot of changes coming and we've mapped out what those changes are. So do please ask for that as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for sticking with us. We are slightly over time, but I do hope you agree it's been a very useful webinar. We have a short survey at the end and we really would like your feedback. And there's opportunities to ask more questions or ask for clarity in there as well. And you can ask, like I said, you can ask to have another look at the calculator. We have another webinar to finish up our year. We have another webinar in December, and this is going to be a roundup of the policy analysis that we've been commissioned to do for various clients throughout the year. We want to share some of the findings with you with the permission of those clients and what this will mean for next year. So please do join that webinar. Again, there's a link to do that in the survey. So without further ado, it just goes for me to say thank you ever so much to all of our speakers, my colleague Zoe Charlesworth, and my colleague Peter Carter, but most sincerely to Darren Thomas from Grwp Cynefin. Darren, we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you very much. And our contact details are there on the screen. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. The slides and the presentation will be with you shortly. Thank you for joining us today. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.